Well, good morning, everybody. Um, this is part two of the news and views from the Nefarium for March 11th, 2011. And we've all woken up today with some sad news coming out of Japan. And we've seen the devastation there. And I don't know about you, but I had this gut-wrenching intuition, and it's nothing more than an intuition, that we may be looking at yet another step, another stage in, for want of a better expression, covert earthquake wars. And before I start speculating, I want to make it clear that I do not regard anything I'm about to say as anything more or less than pure speculation. Because let's face it, Japan is in an earthquake-prone region of the world, and it has had and suffered severe earthquakes in its past. Whether or not any of those were artificially induced is another matter, but certainly not all of them can be explained by an appeal to technologies. But I had the suspicion this morning that we were looking at something truly awful, and I went online and I did a search with the engine, quote, Japan earthquake, close quote, HARP. And it pulled up a little post from a website, www.atlanteanconspiracy.com slash 2011 slash 03 slash Japan dash tsunami dash caused dash by HARP, and so on. And I've referenced this and linked it in the article that I posted on my website and then also on the Facebook wall. And it notes that, if you can see my thumb there, it notes that HARP indeed was fired up after a week of inactivity prior to the Japanese earthquake. And then it goes on to note that just as in the Haiti and Chile earthquakes, there were strange electromagnetic disturbances, lights and so on, that appeared over the earthquake region. Now, I don't make too much of that in and of itself, because it is known that naturally caused earthquakes can produce lights over the earthquake or fault zone, simply because rock, particularly crystal-bearing rock, that is subjected to enormous stress will give off piezoelectric effects. And you can take a quartz crystal and smash it in a hydraulic press and photograph the little sparks that are given off by the quartz crystal as it's being smashed. So this in and of itself is a phenomenon that accompanies earthquakes naturally, oftentimes. So I've been trying to track down where in Japan people were seeing these lights. If it was out over the sea, if it was out over Tokyo, I'm trying to pin that down with more accuracy. But it strikes me that there's a contextual reason that we might be looking at something artificially induced. And it's something that I've mentioned here on my Fireside chats before, and that is that the recent elections in Japan and the political earthquake that they set off geopolitically, we heard very little commentary on what the implications of those elections were. But let's remember, that the Japanese Emperor Akihito was invited and paid a state visit to Beijing last year in the wake of those elections. We have to understand that there is indeed bad blood between China and Japan, particularly because of the Japanese invasion of that country in the years running up to World War II. And there's really no love lost between the two peoples, but political realities being what they are, I think that those elections and that visit heralded a new attempt at a rapprochement between China and Japan, which are, of course, the two Asian powerhouses. And with that presaging a possible realignment of the balance of power and signaling that Japan was moving as far and as fast as it dared move out of the Anglo-American political orbit, I think we can argue, at least contextually, that the political circumstances may have been such that that elite in the West may have decided to send a message to Japan, not to break with the West. Now, in that respect, I did a little more research and I discovered that President Obama had been awakened at the White House at about 4 in the morning by his chief of staff and informed of the Japanese earthquake. And then President Obama had issued the following statement, and I'm reading this. He said, quote, "Michelle and I send our deepest condolences to the people of Japan, particularly those who have lost loved ones in the earthquake and tsunamis. The United States stands ready to help the Japanese people in this time of great trial." Stop right there. First of all, Japan is hardly a nation that needs our help to do much of anything. Certainly it's nice as nations to help each other. I'm not saying that. But the Japanese are certainly more than capable of dealing with the situation. President Obama goes on to say, quote, "The friendship and alliance between our two nations is unshakable and only strengthens our resolve to stand with the people of Japan as they overcome this tragedy," unquote. Now, to me, my friends, that's wonderful verbiage if you read it from the normal point of view that the president is merely expressing condolences, sending best wishes, extending an offer of help. All of that's nice, but it's unusual that in a time of national tragedy in Japan, and unusual in the recent political climate that has emerged there, that President Obama took this opportunity to stress the alliance and the fact that it's unshakable. In other words, I think a diplomatic message is being sent here that this alliance is, as far as the United States is concerned and the elite behind it, that this alliance is an absolute geopolitical prerequisite for American foreign policy. In other words, it's a polite diplomatic way of saying, we are not going to let you go. He continues, "We will continue to closely monitor tsunamis around Japan and the Pacific going forward, and we are asking all our citizens in the affected region to listen to their state and local officials, as I have instructed FEMA to be ready to assist Hawaii and the rest of the U.S. states and territories that could be affected," unquote. Now, that last half of the message is the part that would argue against the idea that this was technologically induced, because clearly we're dealing here with a different situation than we saw obtain after the Chile earthquake. We're dealing with a real threat of tsunamis to Hawaii, the West Coast, and other areas of the Pacific. So on the view that it may have been technologically induced, that would tend to argue, in my opinion, that it may not have been the Anglo-American elite behind it. But nonetheless, I think the first part of President Obama's message is crystal clear in terms of that reading of the situation. I think it is possible that we're seeing here, and I underscore the word possible, that we're seeing here yet another message being sent in conjunction with the possible use of technology in waging a kind of covert earthquake war. If I'm right, that's another signal that the Anglo-American elite is on the defensive, because they have basically managed to make enemies all over the world. And what's very interesting to me is that if you look at that first article that I referred to, www.atlanteanconspiracy.com, again, do a Google search, put in quotations Japan earthquake, and then after the quotation put HAARP, H-A-A-R-P. What's interesting to me is that if you read this article, apparently in the text of the article itself, the Japanese themselves have been running videos on Japanese TV of what they appear to be, and please understand, I do not speak Japanese, I do not know Japanese kanji, so I cannot read the characters on the screen. But if the article is correct, then the Japanese appear to be concerned with HAARP as a technology that is able to modify weather. And therefore, if the Japanese are that suspicious of the technology, they might also suspect that they are looking at an earthquake technology as well. So it's going to be very interesting, I think, to watch the long-term political consequences in Japan spill out from this, because there is another thing that's going on in Japan as we speak, and that is that the current prime minister, the current government of Japan, is being rocked by scandals. All right. So in other words, there was already pressure on this new government prior to this earthquake. And again, the favorite way of elites to get rid of political enemies is to shame them out of power. And if that doesn't work, of course, use other means to get them out of power. So there's a lot going on here in the background. And I just wanted to share what my thoughts were on this earthquake. But certainly, I hope we all keep the Japanese in our prayers. If they have been the victim of a technology used by that elite against their nation, it will be, at least at the minimum, the third time that a horrendous technology was used. Um, if the Japanese suspect that, if their government suspects it, and if it reaches the point of a national sense of urgency about that technology, we need to watch and pay very close attention to the political evolution taking place in Japan in the next few months, because that will tell us a lot about what they think actually happened. Anyway, that's part 2 of the news and views from the Nefarium for March the 11th, and I'll see everybody on the flip side. Bye-bye.